Good afternoon. My name is Luboslav Valkoci from KV Control. We invited Tino Vande Capelle, functional safety expert. May I kindly ask you to introduce yourself and spend some sentences what motivated you to decide career in functional safety?
Good afternoon, Lubo. My name is Tino Vande Capelle. Thank you for the invite to the podcast. My background is instrumentation engineer on a gas plant from end of the 80s, moving into process control systems, finally ending up with safety vendors of safety platforms. And I founded, together with three other gentlemen, we founded the functional safety program for TOV Rheinland. And my motivation was to try to transfer some know-how on the basics of functional safety into the industry.
May I ask you what principles and values guided your professional life?
I would say learn by doing is one of them. Making mistakes ourselves in the industry during projects, during services, like doing field service, maintenance, startups, commissioning. And when the initial standard came out was the 1997 61508, they introduced us to a whole new world of prediction on failures, which was the SIL levels, as we still call them today, which SIL is standing for safety integrity levels. And from then onwards, we had a other standard for the process industry, which was the IEC 61511, that actually was teaching all the engineers worldwide to do their activities in the field in a systematic way.
Can you share one or two cases where the functional safety made a real difference?
I can certainly do that. One of the occasions that I typically will give as an example during my lectures for TOV Rheinland and our functional safety engineer SIS competency program review is that I refer to a specific project for a refinery that actually was due to management commitment for budget constraint, was telling the hazard and risk analysis engineers the solutions that they came up were installing additional shutdown valves that didn't fit the budget. So management was telling the team to redo their, let's say, study to come up with a less costly solution, which they did. Which at the end of the day, there was an incident on that refinery many years after, with the lessons learned that if they would have installed those specific safety valves on that refinery, the accident could have never occurred. That is one example. And the second example is that when functional safety has been applied on a specific project, this was again on a gas plant, the people learned that by adopting the new edition of that standard at that time, which was edition 1 of the 61511, that they actually did some specific cost savings by applying the standard. By other words, in the older days, they were over-designing their systems. By starting to understand their real risk scenarios and their real tolerable risk, they could actually start to reduce some of the cut, copy, paste projects where they used to always use a specific configuration to achieve safety. They were actually saving money by applying that standard at that time.
Functional safety standards are here for several years. How the standards and training involved the functional safety?
Well, I certainly remember the day that we came up with the first initial training, which was in the year 2004, 2005, somewhere in that time frame. The initial training for the engineers, looking back to it today, I would have said was probably much too theoretical based on the clauses of the standard. Because the standard itself, when it was released in 1997, and I'm referring to the IEC 61508, when the standard was released in the beginning, many engineers around the world were struggling to understand the subjectivity of some of the phrases used. So they need to find a way to start to work with it. So we adopted, I would say, the training material itself to be more practical for the engineers, to help them rather than just trying to dictate what the standard is trying to achieve, by bringing our personal, let's say, experience from the field through reality in the classroom, that we were using live class examples from, for instance, what had happened in the field, or by knowing what they struggle with. So the edition 2 came out of the standard, which was in the year 2010 in April of the 61508. And that standard is the one that I have to say is mainly used by the manufacturers, because the title of the standard is Functional Safety for EEPES. That's the abbreviation for electrical signals, electronic components, and programmable electronical safety related systems. So in other words, the manufacturers that are actually developing those type of interfaces that the end users are using, they were also struggling with the effect that the technology keeps on changing, so the standard needs to evolve also. That is why we're going to have in the very near future, either next year or maybe the year after, so I'm talking about 2026, 2027, we're going to have most likely the edition 3 out of the standard. The framework of the standard remains, but they are trying to adopt the new technologies. When it then comes to the practical standard for the end users, which is the IEC 61511 that came out in 2004, and I would say in the beginning the standard was quite strict for the end users. As a result, that many end users were reluctant to use it because they saw it more as a limitation for them to carry on with the business that they used to do, or in other words, the design principles that they used to use. So we have the edition 2 out of the standard in 2016/2017 of the 61511, and that's a dedicated standard for the process application. The process industry is known as the oil and gas, the chemicals, the petrochemicals, the pharmaceuticals, and also the food and beverage.
Functional safety engineer training is focused on technical person and engineers, but there is also value for plant managers and executives. Can you tell more about this?
Okay, so initially the functional safety engineer training is indeed for engineers, but if I look at the target group that is coming to those type of trainings, it goes from maintenance engineers to operators themselves that actually are responsible for the production, to the HSE people, means the health and safety executive people, also to the design engineers. So there's a wide range of kind of disciplines that comes to that type of training. Plant managers themselves, I would personally say that they most likely have not 3 days the time, because this training takes 3 days, as you know. And the plant managers will not be very flexible to be available for 3 full days. So we do have a customized training also specific for plant managers, where we speak more about the liabilities of if something goes wrong, how this standard could have been seen as a good engineering practice, which we know out of incidents in the past, that was a reference document that the inspectors will use that. And then for the additional audience for that type of training, we also have a dedicated technician training, which is called the Functional Safety Technician on Safety Instrumented System, where we focus more than for the operation and maintenance activities rather than the design and, let's say, the studies like what is the hazard and the risk, because the technicians that needs to maintain the system to maintain the safety on site are actually not typically involved in this beginning of the life cycle of the standard, but rather they are more focusing on how to maintain it, and especially production people are there to see how they keep the production going.
You are in functional safety for plenty years already. What do you consider as your success in your life and in your business?
That's actually a very good question, Lubo. It's always strange to talk about your own success, but I would like to phrase it as followed. I'm quite happy that I actually joined the TOV Rheinland program, because there are many different programs around the world, but the TOV Rheinland is the only program worldwide that has the most engineers trained today. We have more than 30,000 plus. Myself, I've been involved now for, as you said, for over 20 years doing that specific training program because I was there from the very first day. And by record, I think I've got next training that I'm starting here tomorrow under your organization is my training 256. And I think personally, I have trained over 3,000 people myself. So we have 30,000 engineers worldwide. I think for the functional safety engineers, CIS, there are around about 24,000 people. And from these 23,000 people, I trained 3,000 personally in my own, let's say, lessons that I taught around the world.
Thank you for your answer. In life, there are also moments when you find out that it has not been good. Is there any in your professional life, and what have you learned from them?
That's quite a challenging question, I would say, Lubu, but I will try to give you a sensible answer. What was not a success in my own experience was that it depends, from region to region, from culture to culture, from area to area. But there are some clients which are focusing more on the profit and production which they can achieve rather than on what safety they can maintain. So I would call myself not being successful if I'm going to a certain client, not being able to convince the production management that the reason why they have to do safety is not wait until it will reveal itself when it is too late. So I feel more satisfied myself when you can convince not only the management of production, but also maybe the plant management. And again, it all depends from case to case. We had some plant management taking the process safety quite serious, whereas in other cases, we had plant management that actually walked out of the meeting because the people, the management did not want to listen. They were stubborn. They were saying, this is the way we are going to do it. And we're not going to change because, we're not achieving anything on functional safety. So is that my own success or failure? I would say I feel not satisfied when I know that we cannot bring the message across that people will take it serious.
Thank you for sharing information from the past. Now let's look into future. What are your upcoming plans, goals, or projects? Can you share it, please?
Yeah, one of the items that we actually were forced to start to look into is called cybersecurity. And cybersecurity, typically my slogan is you cannot achieve safety without security, but you cannot achieve anything on security without safety. So now we have to start to work hand in hand together. And I'm not talking here only about IT security. I'm talking about the mix of IT/OT security. So since the new edition 2 of the 6.15.11, which brought out in 2016/17, US, they were 1 year after that, was the ISA 6.15.11 in 2018. There is one specific sentence in the hazard risk assessment activity phase description, which is phase 8. And this is chapter 8, which is phase number 1 on the life cycle. And they say you shall carry out security risk assessment. And they are referring to 3 documents. So one of the challenges that we are facing today is when I remember the days when the SIL was introduced in 1997, everyone was talking about a SIL number, not really knowing what it really meant. And it took us over 20 years to try to educate the market, the engineers. There are many webinars, there are many books, there are many lectures around the world, enabled to bring a certain awareness to the customers and to the engineers who have to be carrying out those activities. If I compare this today, and we are today in 2025, to the current awareness of security, everyone talks about cybersecurity, but they are still not really aware of that because there's almost no training available. There are a few trainings available, of course, but the question is, how many people do we teach functional safety that are already trained in cybersecurity? And I would say probably out of 100 people, maybe 5 people have been trained in cybersecurity. So one of the challenges, the other challenge that I also see besides cybersecurity is the amount of mass data that is coming over to young engineers. The young engineers have all the media available, all the digital media available. They use open sources, they use ChatGPT without having a real reference. And if I compare that to the time that I was studying and probably you were studying, we were always referring to books. And if you were being trained, you had a certain book, a certain manual, and you only became a expert in your, let's say, material when you knew exactly where you can find the answer. Today, the younger engineers, they not talk to each other, they Google it, they do chat CTP, and they believe everything they read. So I'm a bit skeptical on open sources because there's no real control mechanism. But on the other hand, you can train a certain bot with some intelligence that you can help those young engineers, because we need to face the following. There are many senior engineers that have lots of know-how, but they all start to either go in retirement or they leave their job, etc. So somehow this mass information, we need to be able to transfer that to the younger engineers. And I see that also part of our role. That's your role and my role, that the younger generation, we should encourage them, to try to come to this type of training courses, because there is so much, let's say, know-how that we are sharing from a practical point of view, that you may read many books, you may never get the same experience that if you have it told to you in a verbal way.
What keeps you motivated to teach functional safety year by year?
That's another very valid question, because you can ask yourself the question, how can you be motivated by doing 256 times the same training? And I can promise you it is never be the same training for me. And the reason why I say that, I've trained also some other trainers. So under my license, we also have multiple trainers, and I train them not only through video recording, but when I compare the recording from several sessions, I can find myself talking about different examples, because I am trying to adapt to the group of people in my training room. I give an example. For instance, when I have an end user in my training room, and I sometimes do customize for end users only, like I also have done one for KFB. Well, with that end user, it doesn't make sense if you have people from a refinery to start to talk about the chemical process, because they are refinery people. Opposite, when I'm in a chemical engineering world and I'm in the designers, let's say with an EPC contractor, which stands for engineering procurement contractor, well, then we will more talk about what interest can they have in, let's say, knowing the examples we're going to give them can help them in their future design for some projects. So my motivation basically is always the appreciation you get from your audience. Clearly, when people are actually starting to write the exam with us, and the passing rate currently in our type of training is around 79 to 80%, somewhere in that range, that means that everyone passing the exam is always very happy because they passed the exam. And I'm typically joking, and I'm saying, you know what, on the reference they write on LinkedIn profile, like we also have LinkedIn profile, of course, is always the people that passing the exam. It's very rare that someone that fails the exam would all of a sudden start to share their experience. And I often encourage the people in the training class. It's not because you pass, you need to say how good it was. I rather learn why you are not happy or why you think you failed, because maybe we can adjust that, maybe we can adopt that. And after 20 years, you find a certain style. So I would say the following, and then I will stop talking about this topic, is my training courses from all the trainers under my supervision are most likely the most pragmatic, most practical trainings that you can find. We don't really teach on how to do the calculation, because the calculation itself is based on certain wisdom which has not been dictated in the standard. That means the calculation is not normative, it is informative. And that is why I try to keep it more practical on how you can actually find the best approach for your specific needs in your country on your projects.
If you could step into time machine, is there something you would transfer to your younger person?
I think if I would step into my time machine, I probably would still follow the same footsteps which I followed now. Certain, let's say, the data uncertainties is certainly there today. And as we are living in such a fast-moving world business-wise, there are so many things uncertain, but you should not be afraid of it. You should try to learn from it and see what it can bring to you. So using newer techniques, newer way of doing business is certainly something that I would motivate everyone to think about. And there's a very good recent book out on the uncertainties, not slowing you down in business, which I have been starting to read it. Of course, I haven't read it completely yet, But there are some lessons to learn out of that, as a young engineer, it's all the unknown at the beginning. And the older, I'm not saying the wiser you become, but the older you become, the more you have maybe learned from doing some mistakes. And of course, out of mistakes, you learn an awful lot. But of course, if these mistakes are costing the life of some people on your factory or on your production plants, that's not the good message that we want to give to the younger people. I would say, try to understand what went wrong before, see what lessons you can learn from it. But certainly with all the new media available to us, we should also try to take the benefit to try to learn from that and see if that can bring you into a wiser engineer.
May I ask you, how do you perceive KB?
Well, as you know, Lubo, we came across each other in business many, many, many years ago. And I'm always start to appreciate how loyal KFB was to trying to organize the training, despite what, maybe other course providers are trying to do potentially around in this area or maybe around the country. So KFB has been for me a loyal partner that I actually trust. And we are trying to do at least one training a year. And I know out of my history records that we have done many trainings. I actually lost count, but there were more than a handful of trainings that we have done together. And we always have a mixed majority of engineers from all over the world almost, because it's not only for Slovakia we're doing this training. I do remember the days that I was training more Slovakian engineers outside of the country here until I came across in one of the trainings you were also there. So that is why we said we should bring the training to Slovakian. That is why we are organizing here this event in Bratislava.
Thank you. And now, can you tell us something what your students don't know about you? Like what kind of movies do you like? What kind of activities you practice, or something from this area?
Well, that's a good topic. Thinking back in times, we were before we were hit by COVID, we were traveling the world. We were never home. We were suffering our family life. We were suffering friends. We were suffering social life because we were always on the plane. We were always in a certain country, a different time zone. We were at a certain point of our time in life, we were living like a zombie because our body clock never adjusts to the time zone you were trying to work in that moment. So what people may not know that is, when you are living this type of hectic life and you're jumping planes every week in and out, that there is another side of the story, which is called family. So now getting older, having 2 grandchildren myself, I value a lot more the family. I really admire to spend some time with these little kids because they still have their whole life in front of them. And if I could give them one advice is, I would say, don't find yourself a job where your family is suffering, because end of the day, it is not worth it. I may be successful in, what I have achieved so far on functional safety and on teaching the classes. But if I look back, honestly speaking, and now the whole world will hear that in the podcast, I don't say I regret, but I certainly would have done it different because end of the day, I don't think it is worth it. What kind of hobbies do I do? Well, it's also not a secret that many people would have probably know by now. One of the things that I picked up many years ago because of all the traveling, because it's very hard to find, always a good, let's say, fitness room in your hotel, etc. So one of the things I picked up was running. And before my back injury, I was doing quite some running. We were doing like 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers a year. So it was kind of a relief to try to relieve my stress in my brain or try to get, some open mind again. But after my back problem, of course, then the running was nearly stopped. Now I start slowly again. But one of the new hobbies that I found lately is playing golf. I like to be out in the nature. I like to be out for at least 2 to 3 to 4 hours, depending if you play the 9 or the 18 holes. You see always different land shapes if you, of course, play on different golf courses. And that is one thing that I really regret, that I didn't play golf 25 years ago, because I would have probably played everywhere in the world. But now I can say I was doing running everywhere in the world. So now I have to catch up on my golfing practices.
Thank you very much for accepting this invitation for the podcast. Thank you very much for cooperation we did in the past, and I believe we do in the future. And have good luck and enjoy the life and your family.
Thank you, Lubu. The same for you and your family. Thank you.
Thank you.